Right. Reconvening our meeting and continuing with Mr. Porter.
All right, great. Thank you. And actually, I think we're going back to Ms. Margolis to continue with net metering.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Again.
Thanks. Ann Margolis, again, Deputy Director of the Planning Division, Department of Public Service. With a deeper dive into net metering, we could spend many days on net metering, taking a very deep dive. So we'll see how far you want to go, but this is an overview here of basically where the net metering program stands today, pursuant to Section 8010 of Title 30 and Public Utility Commission Rule 5.100, which is the rule for net metering that stems from the Commission's authority to enact such a rule under Section 8010. Under Act 99 of 2014, this was essentially, I was mentioning when net metering was in Section 219A, and there was a lot of detail and requirements that were spelled out in statute. And in Act 99, the Commission was directed to essentially take a lot of that detail into the rule through the rulemaking process. So there were a number of proceedings, a whole bunch of workshops for between basically 2014 and 2017, when the current net metering rule, which we all call informally net metering 2.0, was adopted. So this net metering 2.0 paradigm started January 1st, 2017, and it includes a provision for a biennial revisit of certain parameters, primarily the compensation piece, every 2 years. So every 2 years, the Commission conducts a proceeding where they look at basically the pace of net metering and a whole bunch of other factors to determine whether the compensation elements should be adjusted to meet the requirements in statute. There are 4 categories of net metering systems. Essentially, they're based on the size and the site type of the net metering system. You can see them laid out here, but category 1 is essentially your residential systems, maybe on the rooftop or a small backyard system serving a home or a home and a garage, that sort of thing. Category 2 is between 15 and 150 kW on a preferred site. There's an asterisk here where you can see what preferred sites are, and they're laid out in the rule. But essentially, these are areas that you might think of for the built environment, or where you might want to focus additional development. So these are rooftops, parking lot canopies, previously developed land, brownfields, etc. One of these categories is also town designated sites. So maybe another time we'll talk about the enhanced energy plans of regions and towns. There's also a mechanism where a region and town, this would be the Town Planning Commission and the Select Board, would all basically allow a site to be considered preferred based on their municipal or their regional plan policies. So town designated sites, and then there's another one on the same parcel as a customer that's basically the primary off-taker of the output. There's category 3, which is the largest size systems that can net meter, 150 to 500 kW on preferred sites. And then there's 15 to 150 not on preferred sites. So sometimes those are called greenfields. Notice there's not a category here for 150 to 500 not on preferred sites. So there's not really a place in the net metering paradigm for the largest greenfield sited systems. Just want to explain a couple things about the net metering systems. Can either be basically on site, say they're on your rooftop and you're offsetting your consumption. Maybe you generate a little more in the summer and you get credits on your bill and you can use those in the winter. There's also so-called virtual or group systems where you have a large, say it's a 500 kW system or a 150 kW system that's located off-site from any customer who is an off-taker from it. So you might have, it may be located, say, in a greenfield or on one of these preferred sites, and it essentially has members. So the developer is creating agreements with each group member to receive a certain sort of allocation of the credits from that system that are associated with its production. Those types of systems often serve customers who may not have you may not own their home, they may not have an adequate roof structure, they may not be south-facing, that sort of thing. Those group systems were, in some ways, they serve many customers who can't have an on-site system, but they also may serve just one or two large commercial customers as well. The way the compensation works is your production is netted within your billing period. So if you, and anything you produce within a month from your system is going to offset anything you consume within the month. Any excess beyond that it's called excess generation, and that is valued somewhat differently. Net metering is predicated on being associated with offsetting consumption at basically approximating the retail rate or whatever you would otherwise buy power at. Otherwise, it's not net metering. So there was a question earlier about why is net metering, why can't you be cut a check for your excess generation? Essentially, once you move away from the paradigm of offsetting your consumption, you are starting to stray away from what you're allowed to do as a state in setting rates under a net metering paradigm, and you're moving toward what would otherwise be a wholesale sale of power that would be subject to federal jurisdiction. So net metering really needs to stay within certain boundaries that are associated with offsetting consumption and are associated with a retail customer and a billing mechanism. So you're offsetting within your billing period. That's happening at your retail rate, whatever your retail rate is as a customer. Then if you have excess generation, that is valued at what's called the blended residential rate, which is going to vary by utility. It has to be essentially the lowest of the statewide blended residential rate, the utilities blended residential rate, if they have those inclining block rates, the low and the high kilowatt hour block rates, or the utilities retail rate. Whichever one of those is lowest, it goes in the utilities net metering tariff. Right now, the statewide blended residential rate, as of the most recent commission biennial order, is right here, it's essentially 17 cents a kilowatt hour. And those group or virtual systems I mentioned early, all of the generation from those systems is treated as excess. So in Green Mountain Power, for instance, the blended rate they use is this 17 cents. And any group or virtual system that's not offsetting a customer's load physically, all of that generation is going to be considered excess at this blended rate. That's kind of the base rate that their system receives for all of its generation. Then we're going to get into the adjusters. But before we get into the adjusters, just mention again, you for your excess generation, you'll get a credit. That's a monetary credit on your bill. You can carry that forward month to month from the moment it's generated. So your summer production can offset, say, your winter consumption of energy. And those credits can't be used toward non-bypassable charges. So TJ mentioned the customer charge, energy efficiency charge, any of those other kind of line item charges, those kilowatt hour based monetary credits can't be applied against those. They can only essentially be applied against your consumption, your kilowatt hour energy consumption. Just talk here a little bit about the pace. Actually, I'm not sure if we have a slide later on the adjusters. I do want to mention them briefly here. So depending on what category you are, I'll just go back up here. Depending on which one of these categories you are, there are adjusters based on your REC disposition, whether you have assigned the RECs to the utility or not. So if you decide as a customer, you would like to be able to claim the renewability of that system for yourself, rather than it going to the utility and benefiting all the utility customers, you would receive a negative adjustment per kilowatt hour for every kilowatt hour generated from the system. Conversely, if you assign those to the utility, there's greater credit you receive. Those deltas have changed over time. So right now it's basically $0 per kilowatt hour. If you retain the RECs, you're not getting additional compensation above that 17 cents, but you're still getting that 17 cents per kilowatt hour. And then there's adjusters based on siting. So they're, started out, and then again, that delta has changed, but positive to negative based on whether you, which of these categories you're in, essentially size, and whether you're on a preferred site. We can dive into those a little later if you'd like, but just want to mention there's this other kind of aspect to your compensation. Looking at the pace of net metering over time, you can see we've kind of steadily grown upwards in terms of the cumulative number. This is actually the kilowatts installed of installations. So right now for, I think this is as of the end of October, we had about 317 megawatts installed of net metering. And, out of 325 megawatts of net metering, 317 megawatts of it was solar net metering. So almost all of it is solar. Of all the we have about 442 megawatts of distributed solar in the state. So that's all the solar resources that are 5 megawatts and under. So net metering comprises a large proportion of all of our distributed solar in Vermont. You can see also the annual installations. This is by technology. Again, you can see the emphasis on solar. 2022 isn't in here yet, but it's based on our, we want to get all the calculations and the input from the utilities, the data that they send every month to ISO. We get that as well. It looks like based on the December numbers, we're going to be about the same in 2022 as we were in 2021 for the total year.
So, and if I just might add,
Sure.
and just a reminder, what you said earlier is that currently about 28 to 30 megawatts of solar will meet entirely our tier 2 obligation. And so all of that is being met by net metering right now. Sorry, you may have been planning to say that later.
No, thank you. This is a summary slide here. There's a lot to unpack. Essentially, we've had a lot of success with the state's net metering policies, even with the changes through time. We have a pretty steady pace of deployment of net metering resources. It's hard to predict the future in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, kind of pouring some fuel on the fire to have a higher rate of installations for the foreseeable future, but there's also some inflation and supply chain pressures in the other direction. It is our largest net metering itself, and certainly distributed solar is our largest resource for Vermont in terms of installed nameplate capacity. There is an important factor in terms of the economic development aspect of distributed solar and net metering. There are a lot of jobs that are, in the solar deployment industry in Vermont. And, that economic development is sort of one of the factors in state energy policy, also balanced with reliability, affordability, sustainability, and least cost planning. So, there's always these points of tension, and they bubble up and materialize in any discussion about net metering, including the biennial reviews. But that's certainly one that we would be remiss not to mention. There is, as net metering has expanded, larger remote systems, that excess generation I was mentioning, have become, kind of a larger share of the pie of net metering systems. We know from the utility filings that about 75% of the net meter generation in 2021 is exported to the grid. So it's not used on site to offset a customer's load, either in real time or within a billing cycle. And, the costs of solar have come down over time. And now there's these kind of additional incentives coming through Inflation Reduction Act and the ability to recoup solar tax, that's the investment tax credit going back up, and new ways to take that credit. So just mentioning, the landscape's always kind of moving around here, but we expect solar net metering to go away at all. Was there a question?
No, just found it on the slide, the answer.
Oh.
Thank you.
So we did do a net metering report. We have to do one every 2 years. It was every 3 years, but we changed it to we got it changed to every 2 years, a session or two ago. It's a biennial net metering report that is part of our annual energy report. The 2-year cycle was to align with the biennial review period that the Public Utility Commission has in their rulemaking. It's good to take a deep dive on the data every 2 years, kind of on the same cycle. So that's Appendix C of our annual energy report, where you can see a lot of this spelled out in a lot more detail. But one of the areas we have to look at is the least cost planning under 218C of Title 30 and the relative cost of different resources that are available to meet Tier 2 and the associated cost of Tier 2 to ratepayers. One of the areas, when we look at the 75% of net metering generation being excess and not consumed on site or in a billing period with a customer that's physically associated with the system, is that those systems are being compensated at about 7 cents more per kilowatt hour than another alternative Tier 2 resource. And there's issues of scale here. Net metering systems can only be 500 kilowatts in size. A standard offer resource would be that 2.2 megawatts, and a utility owned or contracted resource could be 5 megawatts. So you're going to get economies of scale through those programs. But as TJ mentioned, the net metering is there's enough deployment to meet our Tier 2 requirement at this point in time without any of those kind of lower cost distributed solar resources being part of the mix. And that's an area that the department has flagged in the biennial reviews and in other discourse on net metering. It's certainly an important aspect to discuss. And in the overall paradigm of how do we keep our electric rates as low as possible in order to achieve electrification, in order for customers to be economically incentivized to transfer their heating and transportation over to electric as a fuel source. And there's the Public Utility Commission did open a net metering rulemaking back in 2019, where this came up under discussion. Essentially, that rulemaking is in a phase now where there's a draft rule. There's still a little bit of work it appears the commission's doing on it before it goes to formal rulemaking, and they have indicated it's going to be focused primarily on some of the process and definitional issues in the rule, and that compensation would be kind of bifurcated and taken up in a different proceeding. But the department had put in comments throughout that proceeding, kind of pointing out net metering being the highest cost resource to meet Tier 2 of the renewable energy standard, and whether there should be a different compensation paradigm for excess generation, not necessarily based on the retail rate, potentially closer to what a larger resource might get through the standard offer or a utility contract. So up for debate, lots more discussion, but that's just a sort of summary of the department's input in those rulemakings. And just this last point on this slide is, there's a focus in our comprehensive energy plan on and through the legislature as well, certainly on equity and environmental justice, and kind of looking at is there equity of participation in the net metering program, and what does it mean to achieve that? There's been some opportunity through some of the ARPA funds to try to pilot other mechanisms to allow customers to kind of participate more actively in distributed generation that are different than the net metering paradigm. This conversation is not limited to Vermont. There's a lot of other states. You've probably heard a lot about what they're doing. There's a recent order in California that's adopting a new paradigm, kind of shifting away from net metering to a net billing policy and looking at exports under a different compensation framework from on-site consumption. So there's a lot to discuss, and we're not alone, I guess, is the point in having this discussion. Is there anything you wanted to add, TJ, on this?
I think we just don't have, I don't know if we have time for it today, but another time, I think the time value of what the value of that generation is important. A couple of us were talking over the break about, we have a lot of solar generation and it's all on during the same 8 hours of the day. And, if you think about the energy markets we talked about earlier, everybody's saying we'll provide that generation at low cost. We get paid through net metering or other mechanisms. And so what that does is lower the prices during that time. So the value of additional solar during that time is lower. And then in the evenings in the winter, say, when it's dark, the value of that solar on its own is not, it's not producing when the energy prices are, so the energy prices get higher. And so there's a lot of different ways to potentially address that. We talked a little bit about load management earlier and all the tools in that toolbox with storage or otherwise moving load around or encouraging load to be moved. And it really relates to the compensation piece because we're paying 17 cents a kilowatt hour for net metering. We could be getting the exact same power for much less. And if you're not participating in the net metering program, then you're the one that's paying for that difference. And so it's a really important point. And, there's that cross subsidy and then the ongoing value of additional resources that we don't have time for today, but I just wanted to flag those for you to emphasize what Ann was saying.
Representative Clifford and then Pat.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you explain the energy burden bin, what that means?
Yeah, so energy burden is generally based on your total energy costs divided by your total income. And the Efficiency Vermont Energy Burden Report kind of did that by town. So, and taking kind of the area median income for the town and then your burden, and it's your total burden. So if you live in a more dense area like Burlington, you probably drive less to a lesser extent if you live in Montpelier maybe than if you live kind of further away, and so you have more transportation expenses. Or if you live in a higher cost electric utility, your electricity costs are higher. And if the income in that town is lower, then if you have high energy costs and lower income, then you end up with a high energy burden. And so those are ranked, across the state in a relative way in that report. So, there's areas of the state that really just have high energy costs, and that combination of high energy costs and low income, lower income, and that creates this high energy burden. And then what this table is showing, if you look at that solar PV column, the top 10 towns of solar adoption are in areas that have lower burden. So the opposite of what I was saying, relatively speaking, lesser energy costs and higher income. And so that's where all the solar is going. This is a couple of years old, I'll just point out, but still relevant.
Representative Pat.
Yeah. First of all, I have had issues with net metering for a very, very long time, and I'm really glad to see this kind of summary of some of the issues, starting with the fact that what net metering has evolved to was not the intent of net metering to begin with. I think that's a very important point. I wanted to add one thing to the cost shift issue, which is that a very big problem in my mind about how net metering has been set up is that it should not have been done utility by utility, each based on their different rate structure and demographic. So when you're cost shifting to the people who don't net meter in a utility whose revenue is 90% residential, that's who you're cost shifting to. If you're cost shifting in a utility where only 30% of its total revenue is from residential customers and the rest is from commercial and industrial, that's who you're cost shifting to. And the inequities are in the way this is structured now are pretty significant. And I look forward to a further deeper discussion on this when we can do that.
Representative Torrey.
I don't know if this is a quick question, but so you mentioned that the tier 2 is pretty much being met by the net metered solar.
Correct.
Does that indicate that maybe that percentage should be different?
That could be one takeaway. You could say that we could increase the percentage. You could also say we need to balance where we're meeting that current percentage from. And I think there's valid arguments either way that we can get into if you want.
Not right this minute.
I think we're ready to go on, Ann.
Great. Standard offer program, I'll try to speed up here. I mentioned earlier sort of how it got started and how it changed from basically a fixed price and statute to a reverse bid with an auction, a type of auction held every year by the standard offer facilitator. Really, most of the contracts have been for solar projects, despite strident efforts to encourage technology diversity. It's been difficult. And right now there's 80 megawatts online, actually interconnected, operating today. Even though 129 megawatts are under contract, it's, the resources get their standard offer award, and then they still have to go through the siting process and go through construction. So that can take several years. Standard offer program does include the baseload renewable power portfolio, the RIGATE requirement, and there was some discussion of that in the legislature over the last couple of years. So that's not included in the program summaries. And this is the deployment of standard offer by year, by technology type. It's a little bit more variety in the earlier years. There's a few technologies that are outside the cap. So farm methane projects can come in, for example, outside the cap of that 127.5 megawatts. But essentially that program, it's run its course to the 127.5 megawatts. There is likely to be some attrition, and the Public Utility Commission, in their last order for the last tranche of projects, allowed themselves to have a mechanism to do another solicitation if necessary, but there's a sort of reserve group that's retained from the last bid process, and those would, any attrition would go to those projects first before a new bid was conducted. I guess we're moving away from standard offer. If anyone has questions on standard offer.
We do have one question.
Yeah.
Representative Sevilla.
Yeah. Can you either of you speak to the kind of differences in cost containment or rate impact between net metering and standard offer?
Sure. Do you want me to take that, Ann, or?
Yeah, I just was going to say this slide here is maybe helpful as a foundation for that conversation, that we can, there's cost contain. Net metering is sort of based on that retail rate paradigm, so it's never going to stray far from that retail rate amount, even though there's adjusters for siting and recs, but it has to kind of ratchet up and down from that retail rate basis. And it's not essentially based on the value of those resources. It's based on that retail rate, whereas these, you can see this comparison of the kind of, this is net metering through time, but also standard offer and the solicitations through time. You can see the difference at the rate at which these projects are compensated. So going down over time, but a pretty steep difference between net metering and standard offer. And utility PPAs are likely to be more in this standard offer range. Standard offer is a good benchmark for where we the costs that we could be paying solar at scale, in a competitive way. So any delta is you're not necessarily getting any different products, energy capacity RECs. The delta there you could kind of think of as an economic development delta. But I think I'll just hand it to TJ at that point.
Yeah, and I'll just add, so you can see that the net metering prices, they have come down a little bit, like Ann said, but they're still kind of a fixed price that you get that price if you get a certificate of public good to net meter. And there's no cost containment measure to answer your question directly on net metering. For standard offer, there's no specific. There is a cap that the Public Utility Commission says we're not willing to pay over this for specific technology types. I can't remember what the cap is, and because it historically has been irrelevant, because the mechanism by which they're procuring is a competitive process where developers bid against one another and try and keep the costs lower. And so you can see that reflected in kind of these 9-cent projects, 8 cents for standard offer. Now, both of these also have another issue in that the location of the resource matters to utilities, and it can drive cost, and neither of these programs kind of really encourage projects to happen at locations where they're less costly. And so that's depending on how much solar is already on the grid and the particular characteristics of certain circuits. Some circuits are better than others for new generation right now. So did that answer your question?
Thank you. And the slide was great. I didn't look ahead.
Just on that last note, TJ was mentioning, a project that seeks to interconnect is going to have to pay, the immediate cost to safely and reliably interconnect. There's a separate, when, you have a lot of sort of residential net metering, there will be aggregated up to a point where a major upgrade may be needed to, say, a substation transformer to allow that next incremental 15 kW project to come in. And that is a pretty big question about who pays for that. Is there a fair, generally cost causer pays, but a 15 kW project is not going to pay that next incremental cost. So should, the next 15 kW have to pay millions of dollars for a substation transformer upgrade, or is that circuit done, with net metering? That's a big question that we're bumping up against as we do face, you'll probably hear from utilities about their solar maps and the areas where they're getting solar saturated, essentially. Just want to mention that. I don't have any solutions for you today. We've gone through this slide, and I'm going to hand it over to TJ here, I think.
That's known as last project in. Stuck with the high cost.
Yeah, I think we could call it that. Just quickly, we've now kind of gone over the renewable energy standard and the programs that feed into it, net metering and standard offer. And so just wanted to give you a sense of what the cost of all this is. And so also an appendix to our annual energy report is a report on our renewable energy programs. I think Ann mentioned, I think this one is Appendix C. And we look at last year's costs, and then we also model the prospective costs for the next 10 years and what could happen, and offer a couple of scenarios under the current rules and regulations. And so for 2021, I'll just go quickly here. You can see the amount of renewable energy credit retirements and then the compliance cost. I think the 1.9% is probably the easiest number on here to talk about, and that's the the costs of That's the rate impact of complying with the renewable energy standard. So about 2% of rates right now. We do a calculation for how much carbon reductions are associated with RES, comparing to before we had a renewable energy standard and what our portfolio looked like then compared to what it looked like now. So under that measure, it's been a significant carbon reducing measure as well. I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I'll move on to the future looking costs, forward looking costs. So we do a bunch of scenarios. I won't expect you to kind of grasp all of the numbers and scenarios on this chart, but really looking at a forecast of under kind of business as usual sales, like flat load growth, and then also the climate action plan, comprehensive energy plan modeling, load growth. We look at different renewable energy credit price variables, how much net metering comes online and what the cost of that will be. And fossil fuel prices make a difference also. The range of total costs over 10 years go from $137 million to $325 million. Now, that's a huge range, 1% on rates to 5% on rates. The single biggest variable really is the cost of meeting tier 1. So remember how we said that those tier 1 renewable energy credits were really cheap for a while, and now they're starting to get more expensive. They've gone from like $1 or less per megawatt hour to as high as $10 per megawatt hour. Well, when your obligation is 75% of your load, that difference of $10 a megawatt hour really starts to have a big impact. And so that's really the biggest variable on what the RES will cost in the future, is really related to what the value, the price of those renewable energy credits are. The tier 2 values we have kind of a smaller range of expected outcomes, so that range is kind of a little smaller. But that's really the takeaway of this slide. So when we think about the conversation of, do we want to go to 100% renewable or 100% clean? Well, if we're in the current paradigm of the renewable energy standard, that's going to subject us to the volatility of that REC price. And that may be worth it, and it may not be. And I think that's something we need to think about through a process of considering this, but that is just a really big variable going forward.
Where are we calculating the benefits?
The benefits here, here the tier 3 has benefits because this is a ratepayer test. Let me back up. So this is just to impact to rates. So it does not include economic development benefits, and it doesn't include social cost of carbon benefits on here.
Does it include grid resiliency benefits and local generation benefits? Which is also for ratepayers benefit.
Right. So a generation project doesn't necessarily create resilience unless it's interconnected in a way that creates resilience. So there would be additional costs associated with that project actually reducing the number of outages or reducing the duration of outages, which is how I would define resilience. And so so it doesn't include that because there's another thing you need in order to create that resilience. Sorry, the bell was distracting me. The other cost that you just asked about, grid resilience, and there was another one and I lost it. I'm sorry.
Benefit.
Local generations.
Oh, the in-state generation. So it doesn't include economic development benefits. So there's a trade-off, right? Net metering and in-state generation is creates some construction jobs, short-term jobs. Net metering in particular has that higher cost. So there is kind of in those, that higher cost is a negative towards economic development, or however you want to measure on an economic parameter. And so I think there's a trade-off between those kind of in-state development benefits and, if you were to get the power from out of state, it might, and it was more affordable, then you have to balance those. This does not include either sides of that equation.
Thank you. Give you a chance to. 2 more slides.
2 more slides. I'm actually surprised that we're moving all the way through. Just in terms of that rate pressure, I said it was about 2%. It hasn't been, I mentioned there was a bunch of rate cases recently. None of those were directly like, oh, it's the res and we have to have a rate case because of the renewable energy standard. It was, a factor in some, but not kind of the direct result or solely due to these compliance costs. I think we talked about the rest of this slide, and I'm gonna just go to the last slide. And I mentioned this the last time I was in here. This is the public engagement process that we're undergoing. So we have these current policies. We have the renewable energy standard, net metering, standard offer, all developed kind of in silos. And so next week we're doing webinar series, starting our webinar series that are kind of educational webinars to do even a more basic electricity 101 than we did today, to just kind of try and get people on the same page and start to speak to what's important to you, Vermonters, as we think about our electricity supply. And we want to start with that. We're excited. We have like 150 registrants already for our first one. And, the second one of the same week, which is the same topic, there's another 60 or 70, separate individuals. So we're really excited for these, really nervous that we'll be able to kind of communicate in an accessible way to folks, but we're trying. Following that, we're hoping to hire a consultant to help us do some focus groups and get some, do a deeper dive with people and try to get a representative sample of Vermonters. We'll probably do some broad-based surveys, but also some focus groups to get a little more information. At the same time, hopefully work with regional planning commissions to get into communities and work with the Climate Council to work with frontline communities to get feedback again on what's important to these different communities. The goal is do that through the spring, so we have the feedback in the summer. Nobody really wants to engage with us in the summer anyway. So we can come back, and once we've heard what's important to Vermonters, actually then I say develop and make recommendations and say, this is what we heard, here's what we came up with. The goal is to have a report in the fall and hopefully recommendations for you all in the 2024 session. So as we discuss this year, I think all the conversations, there may be some short-term things that people want to do. We can discuss those, but in terms of a long-term, we're really hoping to hear voices of Vermonters so that it can really inform the development of policy before we actually, instead of, saying, here's the policy, now we're going to do some engagement to see what you think, even though we're not going to really change it. And I don't know hopefully we get it right. We're trying, we'll get some of it right and some of it wrong probably, but please send out information on those webinars to your constituents.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Yeah.
Marathon. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.